The crowd gathered like vultures around Carrion, their voices sharp with cruelty as they mocked the woman for her dark skin and fuller figure. Serafina Washington stood in the center of Pine Ridge's dusty Main Street, her carpetbag clutched. Against her chest like armor that had already failed, Mrs. Helena Blackwood circled her with predatory grace. The banker's wife wore her authority like expensive perfume, choking and obvious. Fat as a Christmas goose and twice as useless, Mrs. Blackwood announced to the gathering crowd. What desperate fool would order such a bride? The laughter cut through the afternoon air. Seraphine's face burned, but she kept her chin raised. Her brown eyes searched the faces around her, looking for the schoolteacher who was supposed to meet her. Instead, she found only hungry stares and cruel smiles. From the shadows of the lumber mill, Ezra Auditore watched the spectacle unfold. His calloused hands gripped the wooden beam beside him until his knuckles went white. He had heard about the colored mail-order bride coming to town, heard the whispers and speculation. He had wanted no part of it. Marriage was a trap. He had learned that lesson watching his father's fists teach his mother about love. Better to stay alone. Better to keep his hands busy with honest work and his heart locked away where it could not hurt anyone. But seeing this woman's dignity crumble under public mockery awakened something protective in his chest. Something that felt dangerous and necessary. The crowd pressed closer. Someone threw a pebble that struck Seraphine's skirt. She flinched, but did not step back. Her stillness held more strength than any scream. Perhaps we should send her back where she came from, Mrs. Blackwood continued, her voice dripping false concern. Surely there are men more suited to her particular attributes elsewhere. More laughter. Seraphine's grip tightened on her bag. Her knuckles stood out pale against her dark skin. Ezra felt his feet moving before his mind had decided. He stepped from the mill's shadow into the harsh sunlight of the street. The crowd turned toward him, sensing fresh entertainment. She's mine. The words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water. Even Serafina stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his beard dark with sawdust, his clothes simple but clean. A stranger stepping into her nightmare. Serafina Washington is my intended bride. Mrs. Blackwood's eyebrows rose with delighted malice. She had found something better than simple cruelty. She had found scandal. Oh, but there's been a mistake, Mr. Auditore. Her voice carried the sing-song quality of someone delivering poison wrapped in honey. Miss Washington was arranged to marry Samuel Pierce, our dear schoolteacher. Ezra's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. Who died 3 weeks ago? The crowd murmured with renewed interest. Seraphine's face went ashen. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet like quicksand. Logging accident, Mrs. Blackwood continued with theatrical sympathy. Crushed by a falling pine. So tragic. And now here's poor Miss Washington, traveling all this way for nothing. Seraphine's breath came shallow and quick. She had no money to return east, no family to wire for help. Her former employer in Philadelphia had made sure of that when he fired her for his son's attempted assault. This arrangement had been her only escape from a world that had labeled her damaged goods. The crowd sensed her desperation. They leaned in closer, feeding on her fear. Ezra looked at Seraphine's face and saw something he recognized. The trapped look of someone with nowhere left to run. He had worn that expression himself as a child, watching his father's rage build like storm clouds. Then I suppose fate has other plans. He stepped closer to Serafina, careful not to crowd her. His voice dropped to a gentler register, meant for her alone. Miss Washington, would you do me the honor of accepting my protection? The words hung in the air between them. Serafina studied his face, searching for the trap she was certain must be there. Men did not rescue women like her without expecting payment. But his eyes held no hunger, only a quiet steadiness that made her chest tighten with something she had forgotten existed. Hope. She nodded once. Barely a movement at all. The crowd erupted in whispers and speculation. Mrs. Blackwood's smile had frozen on her face, her entertainment suddenly complicated by this unexpected development. Ezra bent to pick up Seraphine's fallen carpetbag. His movements were careful, respectful. He did not touch her, but positioned himself between her and the crowd. "The lady is tired from her journey," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "She needs rest, not a show." The crowd began to disperse, disappointed but not entirely satisfied. They would have their gossip, their speculation. The story would grow in the telling, becoming something larger and more scandalous with each retelling. Mrs. Blackwood lingered, her eyes narrow with calculation. This was not how the afternoon was supposed to unfold. She had expected humiliation, tears, perhaps even the satisfaction of watching the woman beg. Instead, she had witnessed something that looked dangerously like gallantry. "How fortunate for Miss Washington," she said, her voice sharp with false sweetness. "Though I do hope this arrangement proves more permanent than her previous engagement." She swept away, her skirts kicking up dust, but her parting glance promised this was far from over. Serafina stood in the suddenly quiet street, her rescuer. Beside her, the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and uncertain futures. "I have a cabin," Ezra said finally. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean, safe." Serafina nodded again. Words seemed impossible. Her throat closed with gratitude and terror in equal measure. They began walking toward the edge of town, leaving the curious stares behind. Neither spoke, but something had shifted in the dust and heat of Pine Ridges. Main Street. A commitment had been made, witnessed by the whole town. Neither of them understood yet what it would cost them both. The cabin sat at the forest's edge like a promise half-kept. Modest logs chinked with mud and moss, windows that caught the evening light and held it. Serafina followed Ezra up the worn path, her carpetbag heavy in her grip. He pushed open the door without ceremony. The interior was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves lined with books that surprised her. A small table bore the remnants of a solitary breakfast. Everything spoke of a man who lived carefully within his means. "You take the bedroom," Ezra said, nodding toward a doorway hung with simple curtains. "I'll manage out here." Serafina set her bag down slowly. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet space. She turned to face him, the stranger who had claimed her in front of the entire town. "Why?" The question hung between them. Ezra's hands worked at the brim of his hat, turning it in slow circles. His eyes fixed on something past her shoulder. Seemed like the right thing to do. She waited for more. When it did not come, she nodded and disappeared behind the curtain. The bedroom was small but comfortable. A quilt covered the narrow bed. Its pattern faded but carefully mended. A washstand held a pitcher and basin. Everything a woman might need to make herself presentable. Serafina sank onto the bed's edge and let her composure crack. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs she had been holding back since Philadelphia. Since the night her employer's son had cornered her in the pantry and destroyed her life with his. Wandering hands and false accusations. In the main room, Ezra heard nothing. But he saw the way the floorboards had settled under her weight, the way the curtain had trembled when she passed through. He busied himself preparing dinner, his movements careful and quiet. When she emerged an hour later, her face was composed again. She had changed into a simple brown dress and pinned her hair back severely. The transformation made her look younger and more vulnerable. They sat across from each other at the small table. Ezra had prepared salt pork and beans, bread that was only slightly stale. Simple food for simple people. But he had set out his good plates, the ones his mother had brought west in better times. "You don't have to do this," Serafina said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The arrangement. I can find work somewhere." Ezra looked up from his plate. Her eyes were the color of coffee, dark and rich with depths he could not fathom. They held intelligence that made his chest tighten with something he could not name. What kind of work? The question was gentle, but it landed hard. They both knew the options for a woman with her complexion in a territory where prejudice ran deeper than the gold veins in the mountains. Cleaning floors for those who would never see her as fully human. Worse things in the establishments that thrived on desperation. "I can teach," she said. "I have education, references. From Philadelphia?" Her silence was answer enough. Whatever had driven her west had also burned her bridges behind her. The meal continued in quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending pine branches scraping against the roof. The sound filled the spaces their words could not reach. "I fled," Serafina said suddenly. Her fork had stopped halfway to her mouth. "My employer's son. He thought I was his for the taking. When I refused, he told his father I had tried to seduce him." Ezra's jaw tightened. He had seen enough of the world to know how such stories ended for women with no power to fight back. "They destroyed my reputation. Made sure no decent family would hire me. The mail-order arrangement was my only escape." She met his eyes across the table. Hers held defiance mixed with shame, a combination that made his hands clench into fists. "I watched my father beat my mother for 15 years, Ezra said. His voice was quiet, matter of fact. Every night he came home drunk, she paid the price. I was too small to stop it, too young to understand why she stayed." Seraphine's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down. "She died when I was 16. Fell down the stairs," my father said, "but I saw the bruises on her throat." The wind outside had intensified, driving rain against the windows. The storm matched the turbulence in the small room. "I swore I would never marry, never risk becoming him." They sat in the growing darkness, each lost in memories that had shaped them into careful wounded people. The candle between them flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "So why did you claim me?" Ezra stood and moved to the window. Rain streaked the glass, turning the world beyond into watercolor smears. His reflection stared back at him, ghost-pale and uncertain. I don't know, but he did know. He had seen something in her stillness during the crowd's mockery that reminded him of his mother's quiet dignity. The way she had refused to break, even when the world demanded her humiliation. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ezra opened it to find Doc Holliday standing in the rain, his medical bag clutched against his chest and his face grim. "Evening, Ezra, Miss Washington." He nodded to Serafina, who had risen from the table. "Might I come in? There's something you both need to know." They gathered around the table again, the doctor's presence filling the small space with tension. He was a thin man with kind eyes and the steady hands of someone who had seen too much suffering. "Samuel Pierce has been dead 3 weeks," he began without preamble. But the letters kept coming. His brother Marcus was writing them, using Samuel's name. Seraphine's face went pale. The letters about the arrangement. All of them. "Marcus was planning to collect the bride price money and send you back on the next stage. He never intended for you to stay." The deception settled over them like a cold blanket. Serafina had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a ghost, manipulated by a man who saw her as nothing more than a source of easy money. "There's more, Doc." Holliday continued. "Marcus is furious about losing what he considers his rightful profit. He's been drinking heavily and making threats." Ezra's hands flattened against the table. "What kind of threats?" "The kind that usually involve rope and fire." The words hung in the air like smoke. Seraphine's breathing had become shallow, her eyes wide with the fear she had been fighting all day. "He can't touch her," Ezra said. His voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who had made his decision. "She's under my protection now." Doc Holliday studied them both, his medical eye taking in the subtle signs of two people learning to trust each other. The way Seraphine's shoulders had relaxed slightly at Ezra's words. The way Ezra's attention never strayed far from her face. "Protection is one thing," the doctor said carefully. "But this town has a short memory for charity and a long one for gossip. You'll need more than good intentions to weather what's coming." After he left, Ezra and Seraphina sat in the candlelight, each lost in their own thoughts. The revelation about Marcus Pierce had changed nothing and everything. She was still stranded, still dependent on a stranger's kindness, but now they both understood the danger she was in. "I can help with your books," Seraphina said suddenly. "I saw the ledgers on your shelf. If you're going to protect me, let me be useful." Ezra looked at her across the table. Her offer was practical, but something in her voice suggested it was more than that. A need to contribute, to be valued for something other than her appearance or her desperation. "I'd be grateful for the help." Later, as they prepared for sleep, Seraphina paused at the curtained doorway to the bedroom. Ezra was settling onto the narrow couch, his long frame folding awkwardly in the small space. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for this." He looked up at her, and for a moment, the careful distance between them seemed to thin. Two broken people recognizing something familiar in each other's wounds. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out how to make this work." She nodded and disappeared behind the curtain. But neither of them slept easily that night. The wind continued to howl around the cabin, and somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Pierce was nursing his anger and planning his revenge. The first attack came with the sunrise. Seraphina stepped from the cabin to find her freshly washed laundry scattered in the mud, torn and trampled by boots that had come and gone in the darkness. The white cotton of her chemise was stained brown with dirt and something that might have been tobacco juice. She gathered the ruined fabric without a word. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, folding the damaged garments as if they were still clean, as if dignity could be preserved through ritual. Ezra emerged from the barn to find her kneeling in the dirt, her skirts spread around her like a dark flower. The sight of her careful movement struck him harder than any curse would have. She was pretending the cruelty did not exist, and somehow that made it worse. "Leave it," he said. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who had seen enough. "They're just clothes." But her fingers trembled as she smoothed the torn seam. The walk to town became a gauntlet. Mrs. Blackwood's influence had spread through Pine Ridge like fire through dry grass. Windows closed as they passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The butcher turned his back when Seraphina approached his stall. Only Annie Oakley held her ground. The general store owner was a weathered woman with steel in her spine and calluses on her palms. She had built her business through grit and stubbornness, and she recognized both qualities in Seraphina. "You need supplies, you come to me," Annie said, her voice loud enough to carry to the gathering crowd. "I don't care what color your skin is or what size dress you wear. Money's money." 3 women left the store in a huff. Annie watched them go without expression, then turned back to Seraphina with a slight smile. Good riddance. They never paid their bills on time anyway. The small act of defiance created the first crack in Mrs. Blackwood's wall of influence. But it also painted targets on both women's backs. At the cabin, Seraphina spread Ezra's ledgers across the kitchen table. The numbers told a story of careful management and steady growth. His lumber business was thriving, but his bookkeeping was rough around the edges. She found discrepancies that cost him money, inefficiencies that could be streamlined. "You're charging too little for the cedar," she said, her finger tracing the column of figures. "It's worth twice what you're asking." Ezra looked over her shoulder. The scent of her hair, clean and faintly floral, made his chest tighten. He had never been this close to a woman who did not flinch from his presence. The mill in Copper Creek charges half that for pine. Cedar is different, stronger, more beautiful. She looked up at him, and he saw something new in her eyes. Confidence, purpose. You're not just selling wood. You're selling quality. Her changes to his pricing structure would increase his profits by 30%. But more than that, she had seen value where he had seen only raw material. The insight made him wonder what other things he had undervalued. The church service on Sunday became a battleground. Mrs. Blackwood had positioned herself and her allies in the front pews, a solid wall of judgment and disapproval. When Seraphina entered with Ezra, the whispers rose like steam from hot water. Reverend Morrison was a kind man caught between his conscience and his congregation. He had watched Mrs. Blackwood's campaign with growing unease, but he also knew where the church's donations came from. His sermon that morning focused on charity and Christian love, but his eyes avoided Seraphina's face. During the closing prayer, Mrs. Blackwood stood abruptly. Her voice cut through the sacred quiet. Before we leave this holy place, we must address the impropriety in our midst. Her finger pointed at Seraphina with the certainty of divine judgment. This woman's presence makes a mockery of Christian marriage and decent society. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement. Others stared at their hands, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Seraphina rose slowly from her pew. The entire church held its breath. She had been pushed and pushed, her dignity chipped away one cruel word at a time. But she had reached bedrock now, the place where her true strength lived. I may not be what you expected, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. But I am a child of God as much as anyone here. I ask only for the chance to prove my worth through my actions, not your assumptions. Her words hung in the air like incense. Several people shifted in their seats. A few looked ashamed. But Mrs. Blackwood's face hardened with renewed determination. Pretty words from a woman living in sin. The accusation hit its mark. Even those who had been softening toward Seraphina now looked uncertain. The arrangement with Ezra was unconventional, potentially scandalous. Doubt crept across faces that had been warming to her quiet dignity. That night, the rocks came through. Their windows, 3 stones, each the size of a man's fist, shattered the glass and scattered fragments across the cabin floor. A note wrapped around one of them bore a single word: leave. Seraphina and Ezra knelt together, picking up the broken pieces. Their hands moved in careful coordination, sorting the larger shards from the smaller ones. The task required concentration, but beneath the surface, something else was happening. Their fingers brushed as they reached for the same piece of glass. Neither pulled away. The contact was brief, electric, and entirely inappropriate given their arrangement. But it felt more real than anything either had experienced in years. This can't continue, Seraphina said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she placed glass fragments in a basket. I won't have you hurt because of me. Ezra looked at her kneeling beside him, her profile illuminated by lamplight. Somewhere in the week since she had arrived, she had stopped being a stranger he was protecting and become someone he could not imagine living without. I won't let them drive you away. The words came out rougher than he intended. They carried weight beyond their simple meaning, implications that made both of them still. Ezra. His name on her lips sounded different than it had before, softer, more personal. He reached for her hand, covering her fingers with his own. His skin was rough from years of working with wood and rope, but his touch was gentle, reverent. I know this isn't what you planned, what either of us planned. But I've come to care for you, Seraphina, more than I thought possible. The confession settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. She looked down at their joined hands, his pale skin against her darker fingers. The contrast that the town found so offensive seemed beautiful in the lamplight. "I care for you too," she whispered. "But caring and surviving aren't the same thing." He lifted her chin with his free hand, forcing her to meet his eyes. They were gray as storm clouds and just as intense. "Marry me, not because you need protection, but because I need you. Because you see value in things I thought were worthless. Because you make me want to be better than I am." The proposal hung between them, fragile and precious. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters they had hastily nailed over the broken windows. The sound reminded them both of the forces arrayed against them. "Yes," she said, and the word changed everything. They were still kneeling on the floor surrounded by broken glass, but suddenly the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The dangers outside had not diminished, but they would face them together now. As they finished cleaning up the mess, their movements had acquired a new quality. They were no longer two strangers sharing space, but partners beginning to build something that could last. The broken windows would be repaired. The threats would be answered. But the connection forged in the lamplight among the glass fragments was stronger than anything their enemies could shatter. The wedding preparations became acts of quiet rebellion. Annie Oakley arrived at the cabin with fabric wrapped in brown paper, her face set with determination that matched the storm clouds gathering overhead. "Blue silk," she announced, unfolding the material on Seraphine's kitchen table. "Been saving it for someone special." The fabric caught the lamplight and held it, transforming the modest cabin into something that felt sacred. Seraphine's fingers traced the smooth surface, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included joy. But joy in Pine Ridge came with a price. The harassment had escalated beyond broken windows and ruined laundry. Someone had followed Seraphina to the well, close enough that she could hear breathing behind her. When she turned, the shadows held nothing but malice and the sound of retreating footsteps. A noose appeared on their doorstep one morning, coiled neat as a sleeping snake. Ezra burned it without comment, but his hands lingered on the axe handle. When he chopped wood, the rhythm of his strikes had changed, becoming harder, more violent. The wood split clean but angry. Doc Holliday found them 3 days before the wedding, his medical bag clutched tight and his usual calm cracked around the edges. He set his hat on the table with the careful precision of a man trying to control his temper. "We need to talk about Helena Blackwood." Seraphina looked up from her sewing. The wedding dress was nearly finished, its blue silk pooled around her feet like water. But something in the doctor's voice made her set down her needle. "Her campaign against you isn't just about prejudice," Doc Holliday continued. "I've been watching her, wondering why she's so determined to drive you away. The intensity seems personal." Ezra leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "What did you find?" "Missing money. The town's development fund has been bleeding for months. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Someone with access to the accounts has been very careful, very clever." The implications settled over them like smoke. Seraphine's accounting skills, her education, her careful eye for numbers. In the wrong hands, those abilities could uncover crimes that were meant to stay buried. "She's afraid of me," Seraphina said. Quietly, "Not because of my skin or my body, but because of what I know how to do." Doc Holliday nodded grimly. "A woman who can read ledgers and spot discrepancies. Who might ask uncomfortable questions about where the money for the new church roof disappeared to." The doctor opened his bag and pulled out a collection of papers. Bank statements, receipts, official documents that painted a picture of systematic theft stretching back 2 years. "I've been gathering evidence, but I need someone who understands numbers to make sense of it all. Someone who can trace the patterns." Seraphine's hands stilled on the silk fabric. The wedding dress suddenly felt heavy, weighted with more than just her hopes for the future. She was being asked to step into the line of fire, to make herself an even bigger target. "If I help you, there's no going back," she said. "She know I'm a real threat." "You're already a threat," Ezra said from the doorway. "That's why she wants you gone." The papers spread across the table told a story of greed disguised as civic duty. Mrs. Blackwood had been skimming money from every municipal project, every community improvement. The missing funds amounted to thousands of dollars, enough to destroy lives and futures. Seraphine's trained eye caught patterns that others had missed. Inflated invoices for materials that were never delivered. Payments to contractors who existed only on paper. The theft was sophisticated, methodical, and completely damning. "She's been stealing from the church fund too," Serafina said, her finger tracing a column of figures. "The money for the orphanage repairs, the widow's relief fund. She's been taking from the people who can least afford to lose it." The enormity of the betrayal filled the cabin like smoke. Mrs. Blackwood had not just been stealing money. She had been stealing hope, taking resources meant to help the vulnerable and using them to line her own pockets. "There's more," Doc Holliday said heavily. "Marcus Pierce isn't just angry about losing his bride Price. He's been working with Helena. She's been paying him to spread rumors, to organize the harassment." The revelation hit like a physical blow. The campaign against Serafina had been orchestrated, funded, and directed by the woman she had threatened simply by existing. "How?" "Long before they escalate?" Ezra asked. His voice was steady, but his hands had curled into fists. "Not long. Marcus has been drinking more, talking louder. He's been asking questions about your routines, when you're alone, where you go." The threat hung in the air like storm clouds. They all understood what Marcus Pierce was capable of when alcohol and desperation mixed with Helena Blackwood's money. "The wedding," Serafina said suddenly. "They'll try something during the wedding." It was the perfect opportunity. A public gathering, emotions running high, the entire town watching. If something happened to Serafina during the ceremony, it could be dismissed as passion overcoming reason. A tragic accident born of community tensions. "We could postpone," Ezra said, but his voice lacked conviction. Postponing would be surrender, an admission that fear had won. "No." Seraphine's voice carried the quiet strength that had sustained her through every trial. "I won't let them steal this from us too." She looked at the evidence spread across her table, then at the wedding dress hanging from the cabin's beam. Two symbols of her life in Pine Ridge, one representing the darkness she had uncovered, the other the light she had found. "We go forward with the wedding, but we do it knowing what we're facing." Doc Holliday gathered his papers slowly. "I'll position myself where I can watch the crowd. And I'll make sure the territorial marshal gets copies of everything we found." After he left, Serafina and Ezra sat in the growing darkness. The lamp between them cast their shadows large on the cabin walls, two figures preparing for a battle they had never wanted to fight. "We could leave," Ezra said quietly. "Take the evidence to the territorial capital, start over somewhere else." Serafina shook her head. "I've run before. From Philadelphia, from everything I knew. Running just makes the next place easier to abandon." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the forest that had become her home. The trees stood straight and strong, their roots deep in soil that had nourished them through storms and seasons. "This is where we make our stand." Ezra joined her at the window. Their reflection in the glass showed two people who had found something worth fighting for. Not just each other, but the idea that love could triumph over hatred, that truth could defeat lies. "Then we make it together." The wedding was 2 days away. Somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were planning their final assault. But in the small cabin at the forest's edge, two people were preparing for more than a ceremony. They were preparing for a war that would determine not just their future, but the soul of Pine Ridge itself. The evidence of Helena Blackwood's crimes lay hidden beneath their floorboards, waiting for the right moment to see daylight. The wedding dress hung ready, its blue silk catching moonlight through the window. Both symbols of hope in a world that had tried to extinguish it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But tonight, in the quiet space between crisis and resolution, Serafina and Ezra held each other close and prepared to face whatever came next. Together, the wedding morning arrived with deceptive calm. Sunlight filtered through the cabins. Repaired windows casting golden squares on the floor where Serafina prepared for her marriage. The blue silk dress transformed her, its color bringing out the warmth in her dark skin and the intelligence in her eyes. Annie Oakley braided wildflowers into Seraphine's hair, her weathered hands gentle as a mother's. Neither woman spoke about the tension that hung over Pine Ridge like smoke from a distant fire. Today was about hope, about the possibility that love could survive in hostile ground. At the church, Doc Holliday positioned himself near the back, his medical bag at his feet and his eyes scanning the gathering crowd. The territorial marshal had received their evidence, but justice moved slowly in frontier towns. Today they would have to rely on courage and the hope that decency would prevail. Ezra stood at the altar in his best suit, his hands steady despite the storm building in his chest. The lumberjacks from his crew filled 3 pews, their presence both support and warning. These were men who understood loyalty, who would not stand by while their boss was threatened. The church filled slowly. Some came out of genuine goodwill, others from curiosity about the scandal that had consumed their town. Mrs. Blackwood arrived with her faction, their faces set with righteous disapproval. Marcus Pierce lurked near the door, his bloodshot eyes tracking every movement. Serafina appeared in the doorway, and the church fell silent. The blue silk caught the light streaming through the windows, making her appear almost ethereal. But her chin was raised with quiet defiance, and her steps down the aisle were sure. Reverend Morrison began the ceremony with trembling hands. His voice carried the weight of a man caught between his conscience and his congregation. The words of the marriage service felt both sacred and fragile in the charged atmosphere. If anyone has cause why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence stretched taut, Mrs. Blackwood's hands clenched in her lap. Marcus Pierce shifted by the door, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. Then, Mrs. Blackwood rose like a dark angel of judgment. This union is an abomination before God and man. That woman's presence defiles this sacred space and makes a mockery of Christian marriage. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Several people nodded in agreement, their faces hard with borrowed righteousness. She has no place among decent people. For the good of this community, she must leave. The words hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the confrontation that would decide Pine Ridge's soul. But before anyone could respond, Marcus Pierce made his move. He stepped forward from the shadows, his hand reaching for Seraphine's arm. With drunken determination, "Come on, girl. Time to go where you belong." His fingers never reached her. Ezra's hand clamped down on Marcus's wrist with crushing force. The sound of bones grinding together echoed through the church. "Take your hands off my wife." The word wife carried weight beyond its simple meaning. A declaration of protection, of belonging, of lines that would not be crossed. Marcus yanked his hand free, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You think you can protect her? You think this town will stand for it? I think this town is about to learn some hard truths." Doc Holliday's voice cut through the tension. He stood slowly, his medical bag forgotten as he reached into his coat. The papers he withdrew were thick with official seals and careful documentation. "Before we discuss what's good for this community, perhaps we should address the $3,000 Helena Blackwood has stolen from our development fund." The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Ripples of shock and disbelief spread through the congregation. Mrs. Blackwood's face went ashen, But she recovered quickly. That's a lie. A desperate attempt to deflect attention from this shameful display, is it? Doc Holliday moved to the front of the church, his evidence held high. Bank records don't lie, Helena. Neither do falsified invoices or payments to contractors who never existed. He began reading from the documents, his voice steady and damning. Each revelation hit the congregation like a physical blow. The money for the orphanage repairs, gone. The widow's relief fund, emptied. The church building fund, pillaged. She's been stealing from us for 2 years, using our own prejudices to hide her crimes. Every time someone questioned the missing money, she pointed to an outsider, a scapegoat. The crowd's anger began to shift, turning from Serafina toward the woman who had manipulated them so expertly. Mrs. Blackwood's supporters looked confused, betrayed, ashamed of how easily they had been used. And Marcus Pierce, Doc Holliday, continued, has been her paid accomplice. The harassment, the threats, the systematic campaign to drive Miss Washington away, all funded by money stolen from your own pockets. Marcus Pierce backed toward the door, his face flushed with panic, but the Lumberjacks had anticipated this moment. They rose as one, blocking his escape with shoulders broad as barn doors. "You can't prove any of this," Mrs. Blackwood said, but her voice had lost its authority. She looked smaller now, diminished by the truth. "The territorial marshal is reviewing the evidence as we speak," Doc Holliday replied. "Justice is coming, Helena. The only question is whether this community will stand with the innocent or the guilty." The church erupted in angry voices. People who had been manipulated into cruelty now saw the strings that had controlled them. The realization brought shame, then fury at being used. Mrs. Blackwood tried to rally her remaining supporters, appealing to their deepest prejudices, but her words fell on deaf ears. The congregation had seen through her lies, had understood the depth of her betrayal. One by one, people began to stand, not in opposition to Serafina, but in support of her. The butcher who had refused her service, the seamstress who had turned her away, the banker who had questioned her presence. "I'm sorry," said a woman from the middle pews. "We were wrong, all of us." The apologies came like spring rain, washing away months of accumulated hatred. Not everyone spoke, but the silence of those who remained seated was different now. Thoughtful rather than hostile. Annie Oakley stepped forward, her voice carrying across the church. "Seems to me we've got a wedding to finish. Unless anyone has real objections to two people finding happiness." The laughter that followed was tentative but genuine. The congregation settled back into their seats, their faces reflecting a mixture of shame and relief. They had been given a chance to choose differently, and most had taken it. Mrs. Blackwood remained standing, her face a mask of fury and defeat. But her power was broken, her influence shattered by the truth she had tried so hard to hide. "Continue." "The ceremony," someone called out. "Let them be married." Reverend Morrison looked around the transformed church, then at the couple standing before him. Ezra and Serafina had weathered the storm together, their love tested by fire and proven strong. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that followed was gentle, reverent, and witnessed by a community that had chosen healing over hatred. Outside, the territorial marshal was arriving to arrest Mrs. Blackwood and Marcus Pierce. But inside the church, hope was being born again. The congregation erupted in genuine applause. Not the polite clapping of social obligation, but the heartfelt celebration of people who had witnessed something miraculous. Love triumphant over hate, truth victorious over lies. As Serafina and Ezra walked back down the aisle, they passed faces that had been transformed by their courage. The town would remember this day, not as the moment they drove out an unwanted stranger, but as the day they chose to become better than their worst impulses. The wedding was over, but the real work was just beginning. Together, They would help Pine Ridge heal from the wounds that prejudice and manipulation had inflicted. Together, they would build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been. 6 months passed like seasons changing, each day building something stronger than the last. The cabin at the forest's edge had grown into a home that radiated warmth through its windows and certainty through its walls. Seraphine's laughter echoed from the kitchen where she prepared lessons for her students, while Ezra's steady axe strokes marked time in the yard where he split wood for winter. The school had opened in September with 12 students and a determination that learning could heal what hatred had broken. Seraphina stood at the front of the one-room building, her voice patient and encouraging as she guided children through their letters and numbers. The faces before her reflected Pine Ridge's diversity. The butcher's son sat beside the seamstress's daughter, while the banker's children shared books with the offspring of lumberjacks and farmers. The recovered money from Helena Blackwood's theft had built more than just a schoolhouse. The church roof gleamed with new shingles, the orphanage had been repaired, and the widow's relief fund had been restored. But the real transformation was deeper, rooted in the community's recognition of what they had almost lost to fear and manipulation. Ezra's lumber business flourished under Seraphine's careful management. His pricing reflected the true value of his work now, and his books balanced with mathematical precision. But more than profit, they had built a partnership that extended beyond ledgers and invoices. She saw potential where he saw only raw material, and he provided the steady strength that allowed her vision to take root. The afternoon sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows as Seraphina dismissed her students. Their chatter filled the air with the sound of young voices unencumbered by the prejudices that had once divided their parents. They ran toward home with the careless joy of children who had never known their teacher as anything but the woman who helped them discover the world through words and numbers. Annie Oakley appeared in the doorway as the last student departed, her weathered face creased with satisfaction. The friendship between the two women had deepened through shared struggle and mutual respect. Annie had become more than an ally. She was family in the way that mattered most. "Stage came in today," Annie said, settling into one of the small desks with practiced ease. "New mail order bride. Irish girl, looks scared as a rabbit in a thunderstorm." Seraphina paused in her gathering of papers. The memory of her own arrival in Pine Ridge remained vivid, the fear and desperation of standing alone in a hostile crowd. She understood the courage it took to travel across a continent toward an uncertain future. Where is she now? Doc Holliday's. Got her. Seems the man she was meant to marry died last week. Consumption. She's got nowhere to go and no money to get there. The parallel to her own story was not lost on Seraphina. Another woman discarded by circumstance, vulnerable to the predatory kindness of those who would exploit her desperation. But Pine Ridge had learned from its mistakes, had chosen to become something better than its worst impulses. "We'll help her," Seraphina said, and the words carried the weight of experience and determination. "This town owes a debt to women in need." They walked together toward the center of town, past the rebuilt church and the thriving businesses that had grown from the community's newfound prosperity. The afternoon light painted everything golden, transforming the dusty streets into something that felt blessed. At Doc Holliday's clinic, they found a young woman with red hair and green eyes swollen from crying. She sat hunched in a chair, her small frame dwarfed by the magnitude of her situation. Her name was Bridget O'Sullivan, and she had traveled from Boston with nothing but hope and a contract that death had voided. Seraphina knelt beside her chair, her voice gentle with understanding. "I know how frightening this must be. I came here under similar circumstances, and I found more than I dared hope for." Bridget's eyes searched Seraphine's face, looking for the deception she had been taught to expect. But she found only kindness and the hard-won wisdom of someone who had survived her own version of this nightmare. "The town will help you," Seraphina continued. We've learned that protecting the vulnerable makes us all stronger. The promise was kept. Within a week, Bridget had found work at the general store and lodging with a widow who welcomed the companionship. The townspeople who had once gathered to mock a stranger now gathered to offer assistance. The transformation was complete, rooted in the understanding that cruelty diminished everyone it touched. Evening found Serafina and Ezra walking the path that led home from town. The forest around them was settling into the quiet rhythms of approaching night, and their footsteps marked a steady cadence of partnership and shared purpose. They had become something neither had expected, a couple whose love had grown from mutual respect and shared courage. At the spot where Serafina had first been humiliated, they paused. The memory held no pain now, only the recognition of how far they had all traveled. Children played there now, their laughter echoing off the buildings that had once witnessed cruelty. The place of shame had become a symbol of transformation. "I never wanted a mail-order bride," Ezra said, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. "But I couldn't imagine life without my wife." Serafina leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of the man who had claimed her when she needed protection and loved her when she needed acceptance. "I came here looking for safety, but I found something better. A home where I'm valued for who I am." The cabin appeared through the trees, its windows glowing with lamplight that promised warmth and belonging. Inside, lesson plans waited to be prepared and business accounts needed attention. But more than that, there was the quiet joy of a life built on love that had conquered prejudice through persistent courage and genuine connection. They had proven that true worth was not measured by appearance or origin, but by the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was high. Their love story had become the foundation for a more inclusive and just community, showing that hearts could change and towns could heal. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and anchored in the certainty that they would face whatever came together. Pine Ridge had learned to see value in the unexpected, to find strength in diversity, and to choose love over fear when the moment demanded courage. In the growing darkness, their home stood as a beacon of hope, proof that even in the hardest ground, love could take root and flourish. The town that had once rejected them now celebrated their presence, understanding that their courage had saved more than just their own hearts. The work would continue tomorrow and the next day and all the days after that. But tonight, in the quiet space between struggle and triumph, Serafina and Ezra held each other close and marveled at the beautiful life they had built from the ashes of what others had tried to destroy. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.